Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this Stacker Chat. My name is Gina Abrams. I'm an early employee with the Stacks project, and I'm joined by Muneeb Ali, co-founder of Stacks. Thanks for being here, Muneeb.
Thanks for having me.
So the Stacks 2.0 blockchain launched earlier this year, and it brings apps and smart contracts to Bitcoin. I'm sure a lot of the folks that are tuning into this are familiar with Muneeb's work on other channels on Twitter and Telegram and Discord. But we really wanted to cultivate this channel as sort of more of an informal venue to chat about Stacks and connect with folks in the Stacks ecosystem, answer some commonly asked questions. So we're really excited. And I wanted to just thank everyone who submitted questions for this chat. We're going to continue to do this and source more questions. So I would love to hear from you. We'll have some info down in the description below the video. But today I'm really excited to chat with you, and I wanted to dive into it, and I wanted to talk about Bitcoin. So we're Bitcoiners. I think a lot of the audience are Bitcoiners, and folks are coming to Stacks more and more. So I'm really interested in sort of the Bitcoin connection. So I'm curious, how did you actually stumble upon Bitcoin first? And what's been sort of the crypto rabbit hole story for you, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's a trip down memory lane. So I think the year is 2013. I was a PhD student at Princeton University. I was supposed to kind of like, work on my thesis. I was supposed to graduate that year actually. And I was working on a thesis that was in cloud computing. And I almost like had this radical idea of I wanted to try startups and try to commercialize some of the research through startups. So I treated like my thesis as like a backup plan, right? So I took a leave from the university, and the thesis was a backup plan that if what we are trying to do through the startup and trying to commercialize some of the ideas that we were dreaming of. So it's me and my co-founder Ryan that I met at Princeton Computer Science Department as well. And the idea was really around building a more secure, more private, more user-owned internet. And we were basically, the team came first, and we were trying to hack on different ideas and dreaming up kind of like the architecture of what that internet would look like, what would applications built on top look like, even trying to hack on some of the applications ourselves to see like how they can be built. And I remember that we were renting out space. So I used to live in New York City at that time in Manhattan, and I would commute to Princeton to go there. And Ryan used to live nearby, and we rented out a working space in this building in East Village, which was a pretty famous building for New York startups because it was the old office of Foursquare, and Foursquare was at that time, one of the bigger startups that came out of New York City, and we were working there. And interestingly, one of the other teams that was out of the same office, it was kind of like a co-working type location, was Sergey from Chainlink. So imagine that Stacks and Chainlink have they're starting from literally the same office at the same time in New York City. And one of the Ethereum co-founders was living on the apartment on top of me. He was actually renting it out for the summer. So like, what's the probability that, Ethereum co-founder, Stacks founders and Chainlink founders that basically like, within blocks of each other at that time. And at that time, like we were actually like Ryan and I were hacking on our ideas for next generation internet and building applications and what these applications would kind of like look like. And Bitcoin was just something that I think Ryan was very passionate about, like, and we would end up chatting about Bitcoin all the time outside of work. Like we weren't hacking on Bitcoin, right? But we would always be like talking about it, to the extent that a lot of people around us assumed that we are a Bitcoin company. And we weren't. Little did we know that we were actually going to become a Bitcoin company moving forward. So a lot of people actually assume that we are a Bitcoin company and that's what we do, just because they would hear us talking about it all the time. And I remember that I got hooked in when I discovered like the peer-to-peer kind of like structure of the Bitcoin nodes and some of the relay network and how messages are delivered. And that's kind of like my background. Like before cloud computing, I was working in peer-to-peer systems, and over there it was super fascinating that these ideas are basically what, the first generation peer-to-peer networks were built. And then I started seeing the beauty of the Nakamoto consensus and what it brings. And that was I think, really pulling me in personally. But at the same time, we started buying Bitcoin as well, right? And that was fascinating. I remember that when I started buying, the first time I thought about buying Bitcoin was $6. It was actually Zuko's tweet that I still remember. I remember seeing his tweet. I was like, I know and respect Zuko. I should probably look into this thing as well. And I was just busy and I kind of missed it. The second time was when Ryan was buying. I think Ryan was buying around the same time. And I distinctly remember that I got in when Bitcoin was $90. And then it was going above 100. And when it would go above 100, I'll like stop buying. I'm like, it's too expensive. Over 100 is like too expensive. I'm not buying. I'll wait for it to dip. When it will go below 100, I'll buy. Then it will come back again. And I think this was before the bull run of 2013. And Bitcoin went all the way to something like $1,200 in that bull run. And I think we were just mesmerized, right? Like we were talking to other people who were Bitcoiners and just learning more about the space. And I think this is the time when we basically at some point were like, we want to kind of like work towards like the idea of a more secure internet, but we really wish that it has something to do with Bitcoin, and we're able to put two and two together. That actually the Bitcoin blockchain actually provides very strong foundations for a truly user-owned internet. And it solves a lot of kind of like the decentralization issues of building kind of like a base of trust. And I think that's really where the journey started. And we started hacking on the first app like on top, which would actually inform the architecture of stacks moving forward.
So I'm curious, what is the framework that you see for stacks on top of Bitcoin? How do you talk about stacks in terms of where it sits in the ecosystem of side chains and layered chains? What's your framework there?
Yeah, so I do think that it doesn't fit into any existing model, and that makes it a little bit more confusing for people, right? So is it a layer 2 system? Is it a side chain? Is it something else? And I typically, it's basically, I think of that as a layer 1 blockchain. And I think the reason why I think of it as a layer 1 blockchain is that it has layer 1 type of a mining mechanism. They're independent miners that are mining the blockchain. They have an incentive to keep all the data alive for the Stacks blockchain, like all of the smart contract logic, all of the information stored. And mining is permissionless, right? Like anyone can be a miner. It's fully decentralized. It's not, but it has a link to Bitcoin, and the reason for that is that basically the problem we were trying to solve is how can you bring apps and smart contracts to Bitcoin, but you can't modify Bitcoin, right? So in some ways, it's actually easier to go off and build a separate blockchain or a separate ecosystem because you're starting from scratch. You can design whatever you want to design, but over here we are working with limitations of Bitcoin, and especially the limitations that we can't modify Bitcoin. So we're trying to kind of like connect to it. We're trying to, it's almost like having consensus between two blockchains. I think that's kind of like the unique thing for our consensus mechanism. That it's really consensus between the Bitcoin blockchain and the Stacks blockchain. And I think that is not typically what a layer 2 is or a sidechain is, right? So I think it's almost like its own category. I sometimes describe it as a layer 1 blockchain that connects to Bitcoin, like it's kind of like tethered to Bitcoin. But I must admit that in conversations, if someone has a layer 2 type model or a side chain type model, then I would relate to them. I was like, yeah, it's kind of like a side chain or a layer 2, but here are the differences, right? So I will help them expand the model in their mind and then point out some of the differences.
And I'm curious, what do you consider to be sort of unique about Stacks that you're not seeing elsewhere in the sort of the Bitcoin ecosystem specifically? So what do you think are some things that are possible on Stacks that might not be today on like a rootstock or a liquid model, for example?
Yeah, so I think in general, I'm very supportive of all the different types of approaches that are being taken around Bitcoin. I do think, like in general, broadly speaking, the area of exploring innovations around Bitcoin is far less explored and is in many ways like undervalued than some of the design space explorations we're seeing in terms of new layer ones, right? Like there are so many sophisticated teams now that are building new layer ones. They are coming up with their own designs. Most of them are basically proof of stake type chains, right? And they have their own unique differences from each other. But that makes proof of stake a much more studied and explored design space than the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I actually think there's more opportunity in the Bitcoin ecosystem because Bitcoin is like such a large community, such a large amount of capital with Bitcoin. It has such a big brand name. And relatively speaking, like if you just look at pure amount of funding, for example, that went into new layer one projects versus the amount of funding that went into exploring innovations around Bitcoin, I think that the Bitcoin area is actually far less explored right now. And hopefully I would like to see that change. And so for some of the solutions that are already exist, like Rootstock or Liquid, at a very high level, I think Rootstock is more positioned as a Bitcoin sidechain in the sense that there is no new asset needed. You can actually try to move Bitcoin from the Bitcoin main chain to Rootstock. And then people can argue like how decentralized or not decentralized it is, but it basically follows a merge mining type of a model, relying on hardware modules. And they have their own security mechanism there, and it is compatible with EVM, right? So in terms of stacks, we do have a different asset, the Stacks cryptocurrency, that is used as incentive for miners to come in and mine, that is used as incentives for miners to process the blocks and keep a history of the blockchain. So I think that's the first fundamental difference, that having a unique asset actually makes certain things easier, like in terms of incentivizing the right behavior on the network. Like why would someone keep a copy of this blockchain? Why would someone process blocks and come and be a miner? Whereas Rootstock or some other systems like Liquid, for example, is a more federated system. Like you're kind of like relying on the federation for Bitcoin to come back from the Liquid chain to the main chain. Right? And that's from a technical perspective, that's a very hard problem to solve, like the two-way peg, and it's the reverse side of the peg that is usually the harder problem. So that's the same thing with Liquid, where you can move your Bitcoin to Liquid BTC, but then on the way back, you're depending on the federation with 15 or so nodes that will help you get your Bitcoin back from there. So it's a different model, and I think like it's great that all these different models are there, like a federation model versus a merge mine type model versus a more kind of like decentralized mining. And people might have different preferences. Like for example, in Stacks, like a lot of Bitcoiners might have a natural aversion to a new asset, and they will question that, hey, why is there a new asset? And the thing to realize there is that with the new asset, you're actually increasing decentralization, because now this is not a federated system, or it's not a merge mine system. It's actually a permissionless, fully decentralized system. Anyone can be a miner at any point that they want, right? So I think the best way to think of them as trade-offs, and I'm a big believer in having more optionality for developers. So I do think that Stacks brings that options, but the Stacks blockchain is designed in a very different way, in the sense that because it connects to Bitcoin, right? And mining is a process that happens like half on the Bitcoin chain and half kind of like on the Stacks chain. So there's a very tight coupling with the Bitcoin chain, and every smart contract on Stacks has native visibility into Bitcoin state, which means that if there's a transaction on Bitcoin, you can write a smart contract that can execute logic against that transaction natively, right? So this, in my view, is the closest thing to smart contracts directly on the Bitcoin chain, which are very hard to implement from a technical perspective, from a bandwidth perspective, from a expense perspective, because these smart contracts are almost native in the sense that they pick up transactions on Bitcoin, they react to transactions on Bitcoin. And that is a very unique property that Stacks has versus being disconnected from the Bitcoin chain. And we are doing ongoing research on the right path. Right now, these contracts can react to changes on Bitcoin, but the open question is, can they actually trigger changes on Bitcoin? And I think that would actually unlock a lot of new functionality. And finally, I think the third unique thing about Stacks is the new programming language, Clarity, which is a decidable language. So on the Liquid side, you have Simplicity, which, like, as a rough analogy, like, it's more like assembly language. Like, it's still a low-level language versus a more high-level language like Solidity, which resembles JavaScript. If people are coming from the more mainstream kind of like programming area, and Clarity might resemble something like Lisp as far as syntax is concerned. But the real true power of the language is in the fact that it's a decidable language, and you can have very precise functions, very precise definitions, very precise gas fees, and know exactly what the program can and cannot do even before executing it. So in terms of security and precision is where Clarity really stands out, and that's a big feature for the Stacks blockchain. Clarity is actually very tightly coupled with the rest of the design of the Stacks blockchain.
Sort of giving some background on the Stacks token and why it was really needed to enable smart contracts.
Yeah, so I think the way to think about this is that like, regardless of the kind of perception a lot of people in the Bitcoin community might have about new types of assets, and I sympathize with their criticism because there has been so much hype and speculation around new types of assets. I think the thing to understand is that the trade-off that you're making is actually a decentralization trade-off. Because if, let's say, you don't have the Stacks cryptocurrency, which is used as gas for smart contracts, then the blockchain becomes some sort of a federation, right? And people don't have an incentive to run that. And you'll have to figure out that what's the incentive? Why would these people actually run the nodes where they are storing certain amount of data, they're doing certain amount of processing? Because you have a bootstrapping problem. Just like Bitcoin was able to bootstrap in a fully decentralized way by incentivizing people to come in and plug in their hardware and mine on the network, you have a bootstrapping problem that initially, in any new smart contract platform, you're not going to have a lot of transactions, not a lot of transactions volume or gas consumption for transaction fees. So why are the miners there? And why are they actually mining? In the early days, in the bootstrapping phase, they are mining for the newly minted coins, just like they did on Bitcoin. In fact, Bitcoin, even today, the bulk of the incentives are in the newly minted tokens, and they're not in the transaction fees. If you take away the newly minted tokens, it's an open question that, what will happen down the road eventually when Bitcoin's supply will start going down to zero, right? And I think that's the thing that we want to avoid. Like, we want to have a bootstrapping mechanism. We want to have the right incentives, and same for data. Like, we can't shove like that much amount of data into the Bitcoin blockchain. And we have experience there, right? Like, we've tried building directly on top of Bitcoin, where we were writing large amounts of data directly in the Bitcoin blockchain, and no one was happy, right? And users weren't happy when you have to pay $40 or $100 of transaction fee to register a domain name or to do some sort of a transaction with your username and so on. And with Stacks, now you can do thousands of transactions, and they all settle to Bitcoin, and you're paying very small gas fees because Bitcoin is not being used as gas. You're not making transactions on the main Bitcoin chain. And I would say, finally, any smart contract platform pretty much needs some sort of a gas payment as incentives, right? Like, why would a third party process your computations if you're not incentivizing them with the payment, right? And I feel like, again, stemming from the resistance that a lot of people in the Bitcoin community have to new assets, I've actually seen attempts where people would go out of their way to come up with a very complicated type of a solution just to avoid having a gas token, right? And that's fine. A lot of those efforts are actually not seeing a lot of developer traction because they're so complicated. So I think there is a complexity trade-off as well, other than a decentralization trade-off, that if you remove the token, sometimes your system actually becomes federated instead of being decentralized and open. There is a complexity trade-off that if you try to remove the token, your smart contract platform can end up becoming extremely complicated because you're spending most of your effort in actually not having having the simple path of having a gas token where here's a incentive payment, just take the payment and process my transactions, right? Versus you're trying to do something extremely complicated. And I think that's a big difference and trade-off.
There's a lot of development within the Bitcoin ecosystem, and it's super exciting to watch developments like Taproot and products like sapio popping up. And I'm just curious, how do you see those types of projects and stacks interplaying?
Yeah, so I think both Taproot and sapio are very complementary to what we're doing. Taproot basically makes more efficient use of space on the Bitcoin blockchain, right? So if you want to do something more complicated, you're actually not bloating the Bitcoin blockchain, and you can have a smaller footprint, and then it enhances certain privacy aspects as well. And both things are very complementary to what we're trying to do. We are trying to use the Bitcoin blockchain in new, innovative ways. If our transactions, like the miners are sending, can actually be smaller, right, take less space and so on, without revealing more information about what we're doing, I think that's generally a good thing. And in terms of sapio, it's a very interesting project. People who are not familiar with it, they should follow Jeremy Rubin and what he's doing. That's more like a smart contract implementation directly on Bitcoin, like literally on Bitcoin, and is meant to be almost like state transitions, right? So you can do multi-step smart contract transactions directly on Bitcoin, which is super interesting. And I think that capability, in some ways, enhances Clarity, right? So Clarity is a more expressive, modern smart contract language, like something that you would expect from Solidity or some other next generation layer 1 platform. But having the this script, multi-party script run on the Bitcoin side can actually make some of the Clarity contracts more powerful, because they can interact with these scripts directly on Bitcoin as well, right? So so I would say it fits in a very different type of a design space that is directly on Bitcoin. It is and it can directly interact with the type of contracts that can be written on the Clarity side. And in general, I'm pretty excited about it. One point I wanted to make in general about this idea of having a new asset like a gas token or not. I've actually seen a tendency in the Bitcoin circles where the end goal of a design, let's say whatever system they're trying to design, right? Let's say it's a smart contract language, or it is some sort of a application or whatever. Sometimes the end goal tends to be that, hey, look, theoretically you can do this without a token, and here's how. And I think that's a little that thinking is a little bit broken in general, right? Because the end goal of a system is not that, look, I designed something that doesn't require a token. Like, you don't really, great that you design something that doesn't require a token. Is anyone using it, right? Is it gaining traction? Are people incentivized to use that system, right? Because if nobody uses it, then who cares that you have kind of like designed something on paper that can theoretically work without a token? And I think sometimes having a new asset both reduces the complexity of the system, right? And gives people the right type of incentives to actually come in and participate on the network. And I think those are two very powerful things to understand, that you could run these theoretical paper exercises and basically have an answer saying that, look, you could do this without a token. But that's not going to go anywhere unless developers and users are actually using these systems. And if the complexity is too high, or the incentives are not there to use the system, like these things will remain paper designs, right? So with stacks, for example, one thing that was very encouraging to see is that because of the way the consensus mechanism works, and because of the way that there's a new gas token, we were able to have a POX contract where people could lock up their capital and earn Bitcoin. Like, there was a 10% yield in Bitcoin and so on. And within 2 months, we went from $0 to $1 billion of total value locked up on the network, which basically means that, we got the incentives right. We designed the right system, that miners came in and they started using the system. Stackers came in and they started locking up their capital. And real usage and real traction and momentum is the thing that you should be designing your systems for, and not designing them to optimize for, hey, look, my design doesn't have a token, and then nobody uses it. Right? And I think you need to ask yourself the question that why is nobody using it? Is it because it's too complex? Is it because it doesn't have the right incentive mechanisms for people to use it? And I think those are much, much more important problems to solve.
When do you think that we're going to see more stable coins on stacks and DEXs, sort of just pointing at more future development and what you're excited about in the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I do think we went from, there was definitely a major change that happened in January. And we went from our master design of the blockchain not being live to the master design now being live. And for me personally, like that was just amazing to see. Like imagine that even back in 2017, when we started thinking about building a blockchain and even had plans for the 1.0, which was a very limited design, we were working on clarity. We were working on smart contracts, and that was the thing that we wanted to see. And now finally having the public infrastructure ready and fully decentralized and so that developers can use it is a very exciting time. And over the last few months, I've actually seen so many teams that I'm excited about who are building these new types of applications like automated market makers, stable coins, these types of meta stacking abilities where, the stacking obviously now, got close to $1 billion locked. People are working with new types of functionality where you could potentially stack and do something else with the capital that you have. And I think that's an entire category of applications that has legs that can go a long way. And people are trying to look into lending applications, and they're at various stages of development. And I don't want to kind of like, basically talk about conversations that are more private and surprise people that I publicly talked about their project when they were not ready. I think I did that recently with someone built a tool for Clarity contracts. It's called claritysearch.dev. There's a bar in the middle. And I tweeted about it, and then the site crashed, right? And then the developer was like, "Hey, I wasn't ready to share it with the world, and I was adding more features." So I definitely don't want to do that with some of the projects that are being built. But I can share this much that I'm super excited about all the work that these developers are doing. I think we have a very passionate community, like where people who are able to put two and two together. That, hey, look, Bitcoin is valuable. Bitcoin is the biggest asset out there in terms of crypto. And now we can actually use Bitcoin as collateral for financial applications or DeFi. We can actually use Bitcoin in lending. We can have smart contracts where, imagine that you're able to kind of like have a stable currency that is backed by Bitcoin or backed by stacks that is earning Bitcoin. There are all these like different possibilities. And then on the NFT side, right, like having these NFTs that are anchoring to Bitcoin, or having auctions with people can directly purchase these things in Bitcoin and have liquidity for secondary markets in Bitcoin and so on. These are fascinating areas. And in general, much less explored than some of the other layer one blockchains or more specifically Ethereum. Right? We have seen a lot of these applications on Ethereum, but I think the area, I would say that there's more greenfield on top of Bitcoin and potentially larger markets on top of Bitcoin. And the developers who realize that, I think they go through that sense of like, oh, this is a pretty interesting market, and there are so few players here. I can come in and I can try to build these things out before others, and that's like very, very exciting to see.
Definitely agree. Well, it looks like we are out of time for this week, but we are going to continue to do these on a weekly basis. Thank you so much, Muneeb, for taking some time to chat, and thanks again for everyone who submitted questions. If you enjoyed your time with us, please do subscribe to the Stacks YouTube channel. We're going to continue posting further sessions. If you'd like to learn more about Stacks, please head to stacks.co and check out the Stacks Accelerator at stacks.vc if you're interested in building on Stacks. And if you'd like for us to cover additional topics or questions next week, please let us know. There's going to be information down below in the description. And thanks again, and see you next week.
Awesome. Thanks, Gina.